No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 11. The Birth of the Buccaneer. One afternoon, sometime in the early 1630s, a Spanish treasure galleon was making its way past the west coast of Hispaniola, when the crewmen spied a swiftly moving pinnace bearing down on them. They hurried to inform their captain, who took one look at the small, single-masted craft and turned away in annoyance. Not sure why he should be afraid of such a vessel, he descended to his cabin and gave the matter no further thought. The captain was due for a surprise, because this pinnace, dwarfed though she was by the mighty Spanish galleon, was bent upon an act of astonishing impertinence. At the head of the 28 men she carried was a French desperado named Pierre Legrand, whose deed this day would long outlive his brief career. By dint of vigorous rowing to assist the drive of the sails, Legrand's crew brought the pinnace alongside the Spanish ship by dusk. The men nimbly nosed her under the bow, then grappled onto the galleon's forechains. Just as the pinnace's crewmen were about to board, Legrand made them an amazing proposal. He suggested that a hole be drilled in the side of his own vessel to make her sink. There would be no turning back. Either he and his men would succeed in their daring design, or they would die. The men roared their agreement, and then, swearing oaths of mutual fidelity, they swarmed aboard the Spanish treasure ship, brandishing pistols and cutlasses. What the Spanish crewmen were doing all this time is not related in any account, presumably having been sharply set down by their arrogant captain for calling him on deck the first time. They were quite reluctant to raise another alarm. In any case, it was getting dark, and the true intentions of the men in the pinnace might not have been clear until it was too late. And by then the Spaniards were paralyzed with fear. Some of the men from the pinnace headed straight for the galleon's gunroom, where they seized the ship's small arms and slaughtered the few Spaniards who stood in the way. Others raced for the captain's cabin, where they found him playing cards with his officers. The invaders put a pistol to his heart and ordered him to surrender the ship, which he instantly did. Paralyzed with both confusion and fear, it is said that the Spaniards asked these unknown attackers if they were even men, or if they were some sort of devil. The answer to that question was that this handful of ruffians were buccaneers, a new and violent generation of poachers on the Spanish Main. The audacious Pierre Legrand and his cutthroats were not even particularly exceptional examples of this breed. From the treasure galleon, Legrand realized quite a haul, a magnificent prize, and then, just as mysteriously as he had arrived, he faded from the scene. Nothing more is known about him. But there were thousands of such marauders swarming the Main in the 17th century. Like John Hawkins, they were men interested in trade. Like Francis Drake and the other privateers, they made a fine art of belaboring the Spaniards and relieving them of their wealth. But the buccaneers shared a common characteristic that set them apart from all the earlier predators. Unlike Hawkins, Drake, and the others, these men made their lives on the Main. They inhabited the very islands the Spaniards claimed for themselves, and, living cheek by jowl with their enemies, they brought the Spanish crown a century of unrelieved woe. The name Buccaneer comes from the Arawak Indian word buccan, meaning a grill of green wood on which meat was smoked over a slow fire. The early buccaneers learned this technique from the Arawak of the Greater Antilles, and it became a lasting trademark. No one knows who the first buccaneers were, or exactly when they established themselves on the islands that became their chief haunts: Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. It is likely that a few castaway privateers, French, Dutch, English, Portuguese, along with some Spanish renegades, were living in sparsely colonized islands from the mid-16th century on. Yet the great influx of venturesome men who turned buccaneers and set upon the Spanish Main did not begin until the 17th century. And that influx was indirectly triggered by an act of the Spanish king himself. In the year 1606, Philip III of Spain sent down one of the most unfortunate royal fiats of his long and benighted reign. He ordered his colonial subjects in Caracas, Venezuela, and on the neighboring islands of Margarita and Cumana, to cease forthwith the planting and curing of tobacco, Smoking, unknown to Europeans only a few decades before, was suddenly becoming a popular custom. To partake of this marvelous New World weed was a point of good fellowship, as King James I of England had noted 2 years before. King James I also noted that he that refused to take a pipe of tobacco among his fellows is accounted peevish and no good company, even as they do with tippling in the cold eastern countries. Of more concern to his rival King Philip was the fact that tobacco was on its way to becoming a major import in England and on the continent. But instead of reaching Europe in Spanish ships, by way of Seville's Casa de Contratación, tobacco was being transported freely across the Atlantic by Dutch, French, and English smugglers who bought it illegally from Spanish settlers. Philip believed that a ban on the growing of tobacco in the environs of Caracas would drive away the alien ships calling at that port to collect it. He was right. The foreign ships were driven away to other tobacco-growing Spanish settlements. On the island of Trinidad, off the northeastern shoulder of Venezuela, the smugglers found colonists unaffected by the ban and eager to swap tobacco for cloth, tools, and wheat, for which the colonial authorities charged exorbitant prices. One English captain trading at Trinidad noted that 20 foreign tobacco traders visited the island in 1607, immediately following the imposition of the ban. The year after that, he reported that the number had climbed to 30. By 1611, an estimated 100,000 pounds of tobacco was being consumed in England alone, yet no more than a trifling 6,000 pounds of the leaf passed through the port of Seville. But the illicit tobacco trade had effects beyond depriving the Spanish treasury of custom duties. While they hawked their merchandise among Spanish settlers, some of the smugglers inevitably found places to settle themselves. From Trinidad, they moved south along the mainland coast to the vast delta of the Orinoco River, and then down the mighty Amazon. The first non-Spanish settlements in South America were, for the most part, temporary trading posts manned by transient adventurers, some of them doing it 1 year and another lot the next, as one Spanish official put it in a report to the Crown. Few records of such transitory settlements survive, and even fewer accounts of reprisals the Spaniards took against them. Among the men who tried settlement on the mainland and found it too dangerous to stay was an Englishman named Thomas Warner. After leaving the mainland, Warner was determined to find a place where he could plant tobacco without further interference from the Spaniards. Sailing around the Caribbean in 1622, he came to the small island of St. Christopher's, one of the northerly Lesser Antilles. He found the place to be well watered and blessed with very fertile soil. Warner then returned to London, found a group of merchants to back him, and in January 1624 was back on St. Christopher's, with 15 or 20 Englishmen ready to sow tobacco. The small number of his companions obscures the monumental significance of his undertaking. Warner's tiny company was to be the first permanent non-Spanish settlement on the Main. Equally important, it inaugurated a European march upon the Lesser Antilles, where the Spaniards themselves had never really settled at all. It is doubtful that the Spaniards were even aware of Warner's presence for the first few years. They kept little check on the unwanted islands of the Lesser Antilles, and in any case they believed that the remnants of the fierce Carib Indians would drive away any interlopers. But Warner and his men stood off the Carib until reinforcements arrived. Within the year, a French privateer under Captain Pierre Belain came limping into the harbor at St. Christopher's after losing a fight with a stronger-than-usual Spanish galleon. Warner and his cohorts gladly received the bedraggled Frenchman ashore. Before another year ended, they had jointly driven away the remaining Carib Indians and had agreed to divide the island of St. Christopher's between them, now abbreviated as St. Kitts by the Englishmen. Throughout the next few years, other settlers followed close behind, spilling out onto Barbados, Nevis, Montserrat, until by 1630 the whole string of islands of the Lesser Antilles, reaching nearly 1,000 miles from Puerto Rico almost to the Venezuelan coast, had been settled. Some 3,000 Englishmen lived on Barbados alone. Close to 1,000 Frenchmen took over Martinique and Guadeloupe and a number of smaller islands. The Dutch, meanwhile, were occupying Saba and St. Eustatius. All told, possibly 18,000 northern Europeans had ensconced themselves in the Lesser Antilles. They were husbanding flourishing crops that besides tobacco now included indigo, ginger, cotton, and later sugar and cacao. And of course their colonies were thriving ports of entry for smugglers, ships who would bring all manner of manufactured good from Europe, which would then be smuggled to Spanish colonists in defiance of the Spanish customs and tax laws. But among all these prospering planters and smugglers were many men who shared in no profits and were fiercely anxious to change their lot. English, Dutch, or French, the entrepreneurs who had arrived to make a fortune from the soil brought with them an entourage of indentured servants to do the hard labor of sowing and reaping that slaves usually performed on Spanish colonial plantations. The servants were as mixed in temperament and social standing as they were in national origin. Some were perfectly respectable folk, the younger sons of large families in search of a chance to rise on their own account. Many more, however, were footloose ne'er-do-wells, along for their change of scene, and a considerable number were common criminals, surly fellows who were given a chance of jail or labor in the colonies. Whichever the case, these indentured servants signed up for a specified period of time, 4 years, 7 years, sometimes even 10, with the promise of freedom and a lump sum of money at the end. The payment might range from 5 to 10 pounds, enough to set up the most energetic among them as planters on their own. As late as 1640, 4 pounds could buy 10 acres on Barbados. A few of these indentured servants did indeed win their freedom and set themselves up as small planters. Others were cheated by unscrupulous masters who failed to give them their promised payment when their time was up, and with neither money nor work they had no recourse but to drift. And many simply fled, with or without giving the work a try. Sir Henry Colt, a planter who went to Barbados in 1631, wrote home to his son George that 13 days after his arrival, 40 indentured servants stole away in a Dutch pinnace. Sir Henry might have added that there went a boatload of probable recruits to become buccaneers. Around the time that he made that observation, some disparate but coincidental developments were casting thousands of other men adrift on the Caribbean and making them candidates for a life of buccaneering. First, the Spaniards were belatedly trying to stamp out the foreign settlements eating away at their edge of the empire. In 1629, the annual fleet under Don Federico de Toledo sailed from Spain bearing consignments of wheat, arms, clothing, tools, and coinage for Cartagena and Vera Cruz. Accompanying the merchantmen were 35 heavily armed galleons and 7,500 soldiers with orders to wipe out St. Kitts. Toledo arrived off the island late in the summer, landed his men, and dealt the colony a shattering blow. The settlers put up a valiant fight, but were overwhelmed. Toledo ended up seizing 700 prisoners, not including Thomas Warner, who was back in London selling the year's crop. He packed them all on board captured ships in the harbor and shipped them back to France and England. He then destroyed St. Kitts' crops and burned its houses. But about 400 settlers, both English and French, managed to escape to the island's hilly interior. After Toledo departed, many of the discouraged survivors took stock of what remained of their ruined island and decided that they had seen enough of it. They drifted away, seeking a new life and yearning for revenge. A few years later, other circumstances lent a hand in driving still more men out of the lesser Antillean colonies. By the mid-1630s, the Virginia plantations on the mainland of North America were beginning to flourish and export quantities of tobacco to England. The Virginia leaf was deemed superior to that grown in the Antilles, and tobacco prices plummeted on Barbados and the other islands, forcing small planters to give up and look for some other livelihood. Big planters bought them out and switched to sugar, a crop less vulnerable to the vagaries of weather and market conditions. Yet to make a living from sugar required not only vast tracts of land, but also large gangs of laborers to do the back-breaking work of cutting, binding, and hauling the heavy cane. White men wilted under the burden, but black slaves from Africa stood up well in the fields of cane and, more important, were a relatively cheap and abundant labor supply. The planters imported them by the thousands and dismissed all their white indentured servants. Facing hard times in the Lesser Antilles, men from each of these groups, defeated colonists, failed planters, discharged and runaway servants, gravitated north to the Spanish-owned but thinly populated islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. All any party of men in a boat had to do was to follow the prevailing winds and currents. When they arrived at the large islands, they found everything they would ever need for survival. Indeed, to many of them, the Greater Antilles seemed a tropical Garden of Eden. The islands always had plenty of water, wood, fowl, and fruit. By the late 1500s, thanks to the Spaniards, they also had abundant game. In colonizing Hispaniola and the other big islands, the Spaniards had introduced hoofed animals, cattle, pigs, and horses. When the lure of bright metal in Mexico and Peru sent large numbers of Spanish settlers off in headlong pursuit of El Dorado in the 1530s and 40s, ranches and plantations were abandoned. The animals roamed wild, and finding no natural enemies, the islands were virtually free from large predators, underwent a population explosion of fantastic magnitude. What is more, the animals and almost everything else on the island were free for the taking. Though the large Spanish port cities, Santo Domingo on Hispaniola, Havana and Santiago on Cuba, San Juan on Puerto Rico, continued to grow and prosper, large stretches of coastline and most of the interior did not see a Spaniard from one year to the next. These were the haunts of the early buccaneers, and these were the places that naturally beckoned to those smugglers, adventurers, and dispossessed settlers from the Lesser Antilles. History does not record how many non-Spaniards inhabited the large islands of the Caribbean in the first half of the 17th century, but the figure was undoubtedly in the thousands. Adapting to the life of buccaneers, they hunted for food and enjoyed a thriving trade in provisioning the ships of French, English, and Dutch privateers who used the islands as watering places. More important, the hides of the animals found a waiting market among European purveyors of saddles, vests, helmets, boots, bags, bookbindings, and furniture. As early as 1604, well before the great influx of men from the Lesser Antilles, Pedro de Valdez, governor of Cuba, informed the Spanish crown that some 40,000 hides a year were being smuggled out of the islands. In later years, unauthorized trade may have reached 5 times that amount. In return, the hide smugglers brought the buccaneers canvas sails and linen shirts, axes and awls, wines and liquors, and above all, arms and gunpowder. The Spaniards' reaction to all this was to pull back their remaining outlying settlements, to prevent them from trafficking with the enemy buccaneers and smugglers. In one case, Antonio Osorio, governor of Hispaniola, ordered the transfer of 3 Spanish settlements from the island's north coast to the south coast, where he could keep an eye on them from Santo Domingo. When the settlers resisted, Osorio marched north with a body of soldiers and forcibly evicted them. All that accomplished, of course, was to leave 3 fine harbors unsupervised, and the buccaneers and smugglers went right on operating from them. Soon the buccaneers were not only trading in hides, they were sailing out in their small boats to attack Spanish shipping. By the very nature of their illicit enterprise, the buccaneers left a dearth of recorded evidence about themselves. But, luckily, there are a few rich mines of information. One is a 17th century narrative by John Esquemeling, an adventurer who spent some time as a buccaneer himself. The other accounts are by occasional priests who went among the buccaneers. Together, such narratives provide a fascinating, and for the most part authentic, picture of outlaw life and tactics on Hispaniola and elsewhere.